This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of my goals with this series is to eventually get around to doing a top 10 on every single set, and today we're doing a pretty interesting one, Arabian Nights. Arabian Nights was released in December of 1993, and it was the game's very first expansion. Before Arabian Nights, there was only one set of cards, which had been reprinted 3 times in Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited. Arabian Nights introduced a completely new setting. At the time, it seemed to be set on our real world, largely inspired by 1001 Nights, a 9th century work of Arabic literature. Once it became clear that the real world wasn't really something that would show up in Magic, they retconned the set to take place in Rabia, a collection of 1001 different planes that all happen to be a heck of a lot like the Arabian Peninsula. Another interesting thing about the set is that for a time at least, they considered having it be its own standalone thing that also happened to be compatible with earlier Magic cards, and the cards were going to have their own unique card back that was purple tinted and said Arabian Nights on it. Luckily they didn't do this, and just gave the cards the same card back, which really set a precedent for how set releases would work for not only Magic, but in TCGs in general. Arabian Nights was a very small set with only 92 cards, and to be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its first printing in Arabian Nights, which means that only 77 cards were eligible. In this video, we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. While many sets of this era were underpowered, we'll see that this set isn't really, as it features several cards that were impactful at the time of release, and even features some all-time great cards. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a first tier event, like Pro Tours and Mythic Championships, is worth 2 points, and a top 8 finish at a second tier event, this includes Grand Prix and Magic Fests, is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it's Juzam, which means we're starting off the list with one of the most iconic cards in all of Arabian Nights. This is partly a result of its incredible art, which I've talked about elsewhere, but it was also thought of as the strongest creature card in all of Magic in the game's early days, usurping that title from Serra Angel. While he didn't have flying or vigilance, Juzam did cost 1 less mana, and it had better stats than the Angel. Of course, the downside here is that the Djinn will damage you every turn, but if you're swinging for 5 a turn, that's not going to matter a whole lot. A creature with this stat line was just unheard of at the time, and people were really pumped about it. Juzam was played in black decks during Magic's early competitive days, most of which we would classify as mid-range. It hasn't gained any points since 1995, though. At number 9, it is Serendib Ifrit. It has the same score as Juzam, but has a higher average finish at its top 8, so it got the higher slot. Like Juzam, this is a pretty efficient creature. As a 3-mana 3/4 with flying, something that was really efficient back in 1993. Also, like the Djinn, it comes with a downside, doing 1 damage to you on your upkeep every single turn. It was really nice that it could survive Lightning Bolt, which was already a heavily played card in the early days of Magic. It was featured in 2 different aggro decks that finished in the top 8 at Worlds in 1994, but it's never gained any additional points. At number 8, it is Drop of Honey. This 1-mana enchantment destroys the creature with the lowest power on your upkeep every turn, and then gets sacrificed when there aren't any creatures around. For a 1-mana investment, the drop can do some pretty impressive work, killing a whole slew of creatures. Unlike Serendib Ifrit and Juzam, Drop of Honey wasn't played at all shortly after Arabian Nights was printed, and it instead became a notable card only much more recently, having gained all of its points in the sideboard of Legacy and Vintage Lands decks. That's a deck that doesn't run any creatures, and it generally plans on setting up a combo kill, and Drop of Honey can come in against aggressive and Reanimator decks to really hamper their ability to have things stick around on the board, which allows the deck to buy the time it needs to win the game. Drop of Honey is likely to continue to gain points going forward, especially in Legacy. At number 7, it is Oubliette. This card is well known for being incredibly wordy, something that is particularly challenging on this old of a card where the font doesn't do you any favors. Oubliette is also famous for undergoing errata changes since the effect as originally printed is so very convoluted. Originally, it worked much like Oblivion Ring, with the weird quirk that if the creature you exiled with it came back into play, if it originally had auras or counters on it, it got those things back when it returned to play. The creature also always came back tapped. With the Modern Horizons 2 reprint, though, the card now uses phasing, which is much simpler. Anyway, because it was originally printed at Common, it's legal in Pauper, and that's where it's gained all of its points. It's a very nice removal spell for the format, especially in Devotion to Black decks, since it's not only a great removal spell, it also adds to your Black Devotion. It's likely to continue to gain more points in Pauper going forward. At number 6, it is Quambaj Witches, another card from Arabian Nights that is a Black Pauper All-Star. The Witches are a 2-mana 1/3 that comes with the ability to ping any target, which is great. It also lets your opponent ping whatever they want, but if your deck doesn't have any X1s in it that your opponent can kill, it's pretty great, since mostly your opponent will just be damaging you, and that's a good price to pay to ping whatever you want. It is definitely worth paying that price as it can take out a ton of creatures in Pauper, giving you some great value. Like Oubliette, it's almost only played in Devotion to Black deck since it adds significantly to your devotion while just being a very good card. At number 5, it is Ernam Djinn. Like Juzam Djinn and Serendib Ifrit, Ernam Djinn is an efficient creature that comes with a downside. In this case, you get a 4-mana 4/5 that gives an opposing creature Forest Walk every turn. While that certainly can be a significant downside, there were a few things you could do to make that downside not matter. First, you could just not play any basic forests in your deck. But one of the sweetest things you could do was combine it with Armageddon. The two went together so well that there was a deck called Ernam-geddon, which was basically an aggro deck that sought to stick a few creatures and then cast Armageddon while you were ahead on the board, at which point you would take over the game. It could also be combined with Zuran Orb. So yeah, it's a 4-mana 4/5 with little to no downside in the decks that played it, and in the early days of competitive Magic, it was just one of the best creatures around, even capable of attacking through the feared Serra Angel. Ernam Djinn was a fixture in standard and extended competitive Magic events between 1994 and 1998, but it has since become really outclassed by more powerful creatures, and it doesn't have any points since 1998. At number 4, it's Kirdape. It starts out as a 1-mana 1/1, but if you have a forest in play, it becomes a 1-mana 2/3, and one without any real downside other than the fact that you have to have a mana base that can consistently make the ape a 2/3. If you play a dual land on turn 1, it can even be a 2/3 right away. Kirdape has points from Magic's earliest days, where it was featured in zoo decks, so called because the deck ran several creatures in addition to the ape that you could find at your local zoo. Kirdape received a reprint in 2006 and enjoyed some more success in Standard as a result, showing up in a new era of zoo decks. Kirdape has seen play in other formats too, especially Extended, where it actually got banned in 1997 because it made aggro decks too good. By the time it was reprinted, it got another run through Extended, this time without being banned, and it made the most of it, continuing to show up in zoo aggro decks. It has also found a bit of success in Modern, where it's been played in, you guessed it, zoo decks. These days, though, Kirdape has been outclassed by other 1-drops that don't demand a forest to be super efficient. At number 3, it is Bazaar of Baghdad. We've now moved into the top tier of this list since we made a jump from 28 points to 67, and scores are only going to get higher from here. Anyway, Bazaar of Baghdad is a good example of an Arabian Nights card that directly references the real world, since Baghdad is obviously an actual city. Anyway, the Bazaar is a bit bizarre, in that it's a land that doesn't produce mana. Something we saw a fair bit of back in the day, but not something we see anymore. It's probably good that it doesn't produce mana though, because it has an effect that can be massively powerful in the right deck, so the downside of not producing mana is probably a good thing. You can tap it to draw 2 cards and discard 3 cards, and yeah, on the face of it, that means the Bazaar makes you go down a card. However, in decks that want to be discarding cards and loading their graveyard, tapping the Bazaar feels like you're just straight up drawing 2 cards every time you tap it, at least 2 cards, and that's a pretty absurd land. Decks like that didn't really exist in the Standard or Extended when it was legal though. It took the debut of the dredge mechanic for it to become really absurd, as tapping it meant you could mill a bunch of cards from your library and load up your graveyard for free, and dredge decks specialize in using the graveyard as a win condition. Once that became a thing, the Bazaar was quickly banned in Legacy and has only maintained legality in Vintage, the only format it's gained points in. In addition to appearing in dredge decks, the Bazaar has also more recently helped power Vintage's Bazaar aggro deck, which is loaded up with recurring creatures like Vengevine and discard payoffs like both Rootwallas and Hollow One. One activation of the Bazaar lets you cast all 3 of those cards for free, which would also return the Vengevine from your graveyard to the battlefield. With the Bazaar, the deck is very capable of just emptying its hand on turn 1 and ending up with a very imposing board. The Bazaar is going to continue to accumulate points in Vintage, but the 2 cards in front of it have more than 100 points, so it may be locked in at the number 3 slot on this list. At number 2, it is City of Brass. This was the very first land that could tap for mana of any color. It does do 1 damage to you when you use it, but it can also tap for a painless, colorless mana, which is pretty nice. It is still one of the best lands in the game for multicolor decks, and as a result, it has seen a ton of play, putting up at least 1 point every year since 1994. It has slowed down significantly since about 2010, but it's still a pretty active card that has gained points in every format it's ever been legal in. City of Brass has quite the resume, but there is one card in Arabian Nights that has an even more impressive one, and that's Library of Alexandria. That's right, the top 3 cards in this list are all powerhouse lands. Library is another card from the set that references the real world, with the Library of Alexandria, of course, being the center of Western learning during late antiquity. The library is one of the best lands ever printed, as if you use it right, you can simply tap it to draw a card every turn. Sure, you need to have 7 cards in your hand, but you can do a lot to make sure that's the case. It's also nice that, unlike Bazaar of Baghdad, the library can tap for colorless mana, which means it isn't completely useless if you have too few cards in your hand to use the ability. It's especially nasty in control decks, which can keep their hands at 7 cards and most effectively by casting draw spells and things like that. It didn't take long for people to realize the card was incredibly good, and it ultimately got restricted in 1994 ahead of one of the first competitive tournaments, at a time where there was only one format in Magic. Once new formats were created, it was banned in all of them, apart from Vintage, where it's still restricted, meaning only a single copy is allowed. That single copy is played in a whole lot of decks though. Pretty much any deck apart from the aggressive ones are happy to run the library, and that's what leads to its massive score, which it has in spite of only being legal in one format. It's going to continue to gain points going forward, and it will likely extend its lead over City of Brass. Well, those are the 10 cards from Arabian Nights that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. There were plenty of cards that made immediate impacts on the game, and 3 that continue to be pretty important cards in Magic today. If you want to own any of these Arabian Nights cards because maybe you're independently wealthy or something, you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of them in the description. If you like this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of MTG Top 10, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including more that look at specific sets, you'll see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.